Okay, morning everyone. We'll make a start. I hope you're not too cold. Put your coats on if you are. This is more usual British November weather. Okay, so it's quite an ambitious agenda today. I've got 70 slides, which may be a bit silly. We'll see if I get through them all. I want to cover three topics. The first is some additional market failures over and above the ones we talked about last week. There are other reasons why markets don't work necessarily very well and why governments would want to intervene and provide services or regulate or whatever. So I've identified, or I'm going to use, 4 other types of market failures. Then I move on to talk about equity and fairness, which I've mentioned several times as being distinct from economic efficiency, and some of the issues that arise there, and some of the rationales that provides for various types of government intervention. And again, I've divided that into 4 subcategories, 4 aspects of equity. And then finally, moving on to government failures, which is a term that's used to describe certain problems that can occur with policy intervention. In the same way that markets can go wrong in rather predictable ways, government intervention could go wrong in rather predictable ways. And the theory of the theory of government failures is not as well developed as the theory of market failures. But you do need to consider both sides of this coin. You know, both policy and markets have their own drawbacks. So I want to look at 4 aspects, 4 of these so-called government failures, which are, I think, important. So it's 4 of each, 4 subcategories of each. Now, I don't claim that that's exhaustive. There are certainly other ways you could categorize these different things, and there are other things which I'm not going to be able to cover, other social values that we want to promote that I won't be included today. But hopefully this will encompass some of the most important, some which are most relevant to the things that you're interested in. Okay? So, to begin then with these additional market failures, and I'm going to look at 4. Imperfect competition, what I'm calling unemployed resources, which I'm going to not spend much time on at all, irrationality, in quotes, and incomplete insurance. So let's start with the first. Already last week I talked about natural monopoly. In the idealized competitive market, you have lots of producers, you have lots of consumers, and they're each individually quite small. And they're sufficiently small that no one producer, for example, can influence the market price because it has too small a share of the market. With natural monopoly, you have the other extreme, where you've got one producer. Imperfect competition is somewhat between the two, where a situation in which you have a limited number of producers, 3, 4, 5, or sort of a limited number of firms which are dominating a particular market. And if you have that situation, in some cases that can be a problem. A lack of competition in a market can cause problems and hence be a rationale for intervention to increase competition. This is sometimes referred to as oligopoly. Examples may include the British energy market, which is dominated by 6 very large companies, the British supermarket market, which is dominated again by a handful of large supermarkets. Although in that case I would say, although there's only relatively few competitors, it is pretty competitive. Another example going back, well, this still exists, in the 1970s, oil supply was dominated by a small number of large countries, particularly in the Middle East. They formed a so-called cartel, OPEC, and that cartel acted in collusion to restrict output, to raise oil prices, leading to recession in many parts of the world, thereby increasing their revenue. It didn't work for long because one problem with the cartel is that there's an incentive for individual members to defect from the cartel. It's a collective action problem like we had last week. So, and also if you raise prices in that way, there's an incentive for others to find alternatives to oil or to develop new sources of oil. But it's an example of what I'm talking about, although at the international level. It's cartel. It's a group of very large producers which are dominating one particular market, operating in collusion to raise prices, to restrict output to the detriment of consumers. And that is a risk of that occurring in any market which is dominated by a small number of large firms. Other issues here is like predatory pricing, where one firm or a group of firms lowers pricing below cost for a period of time in order to prevent others from entering the market. There's various ways in which this can manifest itself. Whether it is or isn't a problem will depend very much on the particular circumstances of the market. There's no one threshold beyond which you can say you have imperfect competition, and below that you don't have imperfect competition. It depends on the context. Consequences might be, as I said, higher prices, lower output, reduced social surplus, reduced efficiency, less incentives for reducing costs, less competition, less innovation perhaps, slower economic growth. Those are the sort of things that might result from imperfect competition. Example, this was quite recent. Google, as I'm sure you know, completely dominates the search engine market. I'm sure anybody not use Google routinely? Has anybody used something else? No, there are 100% dominance of the search engine market in this room. Is that a problem? Well, Google's free, so it's not immediately obvious that is a problem. But what Google has done, apparently, is to, obviously, you can promote these paid searches, and it's promoted its own companies. So its own companies come to the top of the list in the paid adverts. And the European Competition Commission took exception to this, and said that it's an abuse of their market dominance. And in June, they fined Google an enormous amount of money, but then Google's enormous, I suppose, so 2.4 billion, and required it to give equal treatment to other companies in the search. So it's a sort of policy intervention that you may have to restrict this abuse of dominant market position, this imperfect competition. Yeah. So that was a fine. That's one option. You can prohibit firms from making agreements within a market. You might want to prevent mergers. If two companies merging will lead to them having a too large a share of a given market, you might want to step in and prevent that merger from happening, and so on. There's various things that governments and regulators can do to restrict this imperfect competition. And we commonly have regulatory bodies devoted to overseeing competition. So the European Competition Commission is the EU level body. In this country we have the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA, which oversees competition in all markets. We also have other bodies as well. We have an Office of Gas Electricity Markets, or Ofgem. One of the things that does is regulate natural monopolies in the electricity sector, like the transmission network. One of the things it does is try and encourage competition in things like electricity generation. So you've got two bodies there in the UK involved in competition oversight. In the US, this is often called antitrust, this imperfect competition. So you've got the Federal Trade Commission, and you've got the Department of Justice Antitrust Commission, and so on. So you get dedicated regulatory bodies focused on ensuring there is no abuses of market dominance, ensuring and promoting competition in different markets in different ways. So a few more examples. The BAA is the British Airports Authority, responsible for the services at airport. They had an effective monopoly, and they were required to sell off some of their assets to other firms, so there's more competition in the supply of services at British airports. UK electricity suppliers have been required to change the way they make offers of tariffs to households, because there's lack of competition in that market. Yeah? A certain threshold beyond which you've got imperfect competition? No?
Like, let's say that a company is a monopoly. For one of the authorities to start enforcing power, is there a certain surplus that these companies have to do?
Certain profit that they're making?
Making the damage that the company is doing.
No, well, there's no one rule, if that's what you mean. No, it's always a judgment. And people can have different views on whether there is or isn't a problem in this particular market, or whether it's a sufficiently large problem to justify intervention. And if it does justify intervention, then different views on what's the best type of intervention to deal with this problem. And so there's no rules here. There's a spectrum, and it's a judgment. Yeah. Other examples. German brewers were fined for fixing prices, apparently. The UK supermarkets, they had these so-called restrictive covenants, so I think they bought up land near their existing supermarkets and prevented other supermarkets from building competitor supermarkets near them. So, and they were prevented from doing that, and so on. So you get the idea. And it actually goes back a long way. This is a quote from Adam Smith, 1776, basically saying that there's always been this tendency for suppliers to collude and sort of do things to maximize their own interest against social interest. So there's a role for government in dealing with imperfect competition. Okay. So that's number one. Number two, I'm calling unemployed resources and macroeconomic stability. Now this really gets rather beyond the scope of what I want to cover, but the idea here is that in the idealized textbook market, things adjust very, very easily. Wages adjust, prices adjust, and you might get an exogenous shock to an economy, but things all adjust and everything is sort of hunky-dory. In the real world, this doesn't happen. We have recessions. We have periods of high unemployment where people are not employed, where resources are not employed. That may be caused by exogenous factors like the oil price going up. That's happened in the 1970s. Or it might be caused by things within the economy, perhaps by government action itself. Capitalism has always had this. Capitalism has always had business cycles, sort of booms and busts. And the bust can hurt. The busts are recessions and when people are destitute and they're unemployed and so on. So a huge role for government has been to try and prevent this and to try and ensure stability, because markets themselves don't deliver this stability. Why we have business cycles is a long-standing cause of debate, sort of Keynesian theories and monetarist theories and all the rest of it. And also how best to deal with these business cycles and recessions is also a long-standing cause of debate. But clearly this is a huge area of government activity, trying to establish macroeconomic stability, continued economic growth, avoiding these recessions. And they do that in various ways. Control of the money supply being one. Control of interest rates, which is now often devolved to independent, what are they called? Monetary Policy Committee or something equivalent within countries. So monetary policy in all its aspects, fiscal policy, which is about taxing and spending. For example, after the 2009 recession in the US, Obama did this massive, it was called the American Recovery Act or something, a massive government spending program to get the economy moving again, to get businesses selling goods again, to get people being employed again. So that's fiscal policy, that's spending, or reducing taxation to get the economy moving again. Another rationale is regulation to prevent this happening in the first place. One of the reasons we had the 2009 recession was probably weak regulation of the banking industry in terms of the loans that they provide, and that was a systematic policy of sort of dismantling of regulation that had been introduced after the 1930s, the Great Depression. So regulation, particularly of the banks, is one way of ensuring macroeconomic stability. And of course, what I've called here cushions. You need to provide benefits to people that are unemployed to stop them being destitute. And if you provide them with spending money, then they're going to spend it to eat and to live, and that in itself will stimulate the economy because they're spending. So the point is that markets don't work very well in ensuring macroeconomic stability. It's a big role for government, a huge role for government. Obviously the news is dominated by this issue. For the purposes of this module and for your course, I'd say we don't need to go into this very far because it's far too bloody complicated, really. It's macroeconomics, and we're not really doing macroeconomics. It raises a whole host of issues which are, I think, really beyond scope. And for a lot of the policy problems that you're going to be looking at, you're looking at something in science policy or technology policy, this is sort of a context that you can ignore. I hope you're happy with that, because getting into the details of monetary policy is, well, I think it's not only is beyond scope of the module, it's beyond my competence as well. So I'm just going to leave it there, but recognise that this whole area can be viewed as a market failure, rationale for government intervention, and a really big one. Is that okay? Right, that's number 2. Number 3 I'm calling irrationality, and the issue here is that standard orthodox neoclassical economics makes somewhat unrealistic assumptions about how people make decisions and how rational they are. Assuming they've got their certain, I've talked about maximizing your utility, which is maximizing the benefits you get from consuming goods and services. So the assumption is that you've got certain preferences about preferring this good over that good and so on, and you're making decisions about how much of this to buy, how much of that to buy in order to maximize the benefits you get from consumption. It's almost like you're sort of a computing machine to make rational decisions. And clearly that's hopelessly unrealistic, and has obviously been long recognized as such. But now we're getting to the point where much more sensible assumptions are being made within economic models to reflect this, and also within policy. So you can view, everybody know this guy? Yeah, Dr. Spock, Star Trek, very rational. So the econs, the assumption that's being made in economics is it's a bit like this. They've got stable, well-defined preferences that are consistent over time, maximizing utility. They're logical, they're consistent, they are rational. And in reality, we're not. We're people. We're a bit more like Captain Kirk. We're illogical. Our preferences are not well-defined, and they change and depend on context. And all that's fine, but what one area of economics is called behavioral economics has been increasingly showing is that we make sort of predictably irrational decisions, in that we make decisions that are biased in particular ways, which you can anticipate that those biases. And I think that area, that behavioral economics, the insights that's provided is providing very valuable insights for policy, and also providing sort of new rationales for government intervention. Has anybody heard of this, behavioral economics? There's a few nods. Nudge, have you heard of the idea of nudge? Couple, okay. Well, it's been huge within economics the last 20 years or more. That this is Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky. They won the Nobel Prize, I don't know, about 10 years ago for their work in behavioral economics, and that's Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize a few weeks ago. Again, for work in behavioral economics. It's really based on social psychology. It's based upon experimental laboratory work into how people really make decisions, particularly how they make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. And it provides much more realistic, it provides much more accurate descriptions of how people make decisions and predictions of how they will make decisions than does conventional orthodox economics. And this has been filtering through into policy. For example, the UK government set up or the UK Cabinet Office here set up a dedicated unit to use these insights within public policy within the UK, providing, as I said, new reasons, new justifications, new rationales for policy intervention, as well as being able to use these insights from social psychology in terms of how you design interventions, design them in a way that will be effective. And you can see all of this is like people sometimes make irrational decisions which are not necessarily in their own best interest, or indeed in other people's interest. This helps them make better decisions. And I've called it here paternalist. Some people label this as paternalist, in the same way as father or mother makes decisions for a child, or that's father, isn't it, paternalism? Yeah. Well, it's like this is paternal policy. Now, to give you an idea what I'm talking about here, I've got a little experiment to show you what I mean. So, a little thought experiment. we're expecting a flu epidemic, and suppose we are expecting it to kill 600 people. It's a very contrived experiment, but and I'm going to give you two alternative policies. You're going to vote on which policy is best to deal with this flu epidemic. Okay? I'm going to take this in two stages. Initially, I want everybody to my left, okay, to look away from the screen. I want you to look at your phones. You're not allowed to look at the screen, right? You're looking. You're not allowed to look. All right? You're looking. Close. All right? No looking, no peeping. Everyone on the right, you can keep looking. Right. I've given you two policies to deal with this flu epidemic. Policy 1, policy 2. I want you to think about it. And I'm going to have a vote for these policies. Hands up for policy number 1. Hands up for policy number 1. Let me see you. Right. Number 2. Oh, wow. Okay. Right. Where's my doodle? You can all look now. Okay. So we've got two policies. Policy number 1, policy number 2. So people on my left, I want you to look at it, think about it, and I'm going to have a vote. Hands up for just on my left. Hands up for policy number 1. Okay. Hands up for policy number 2. Right. Okay, for the benefit of those on my left, this is what the other guys saw. And then this is what you saw. The expected outcomes, i.e. the probability times the outcome, is the same in both cases. But I presented it in a different way. For policy 1, the outcome's fixed. Policy 2, it's uncertain. And a lot of this behavioral economics is how we make, about understanding how we make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. Policy 1 was framed, hang on, have I got that right? Sorry, I've written that wrong. Oops. The first presentation framed policy 1 as positive. The second presentation, that should be, framed policy 1 as negative. So it's framed in a different way. It's exactly the same outcome. But do I frame it as people being saved or people dying? The results were policy in group number 1, 11 voted for policy 1, 12 voted for policy 2. In group number 2, only 3 voted for policy 1, 20 voted for policy 2. Quite a difference. That's consistent with typical experimental studies of things like that. More people voted for policy 2 in the second version than they did in the first version. It's exactly the same, just presented in different ways. One's framed positively, one's framed negatively. This sort of decision making is not consistent with how Dr. Spock would make decisions, but it is consistent with how behavioral economics understands how we make decisions, in that framing matters, whether we frame it positively or whether we frame it negatively. And Kahneman and Tversky have developed this theory called prospect theory, which explains how people make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. It works much better than traditional economic theories. It explains it predicts effectively what happens in situations like this, and is increasingly being used within policy. It's called a bias in decision making. I'm going to give you another example. This graph here shows the rates of organ donation in different countries. Denmark, Netherlands, UK, Germany, very low. The rates of people saying, yes, I want to donate my organs when I die. This is a whole bunch of other countries. Do you know what explains the difference? opt out. The difference is, in this country and in these others, you have to say, yes, I want, you have to sort of opt in, say, yes, I will volunteer, I will donate my organs. Here you have to opt out. So the default is, you are going to donate your organs, you have to choose to opt out. Okay, now if we were Dr. Spock, it wouldn't make a difference. We would know whether we want to donate our organs or do not want to donate our organs. So we'd make the same decision whether it was opt in or opt out. But we're not Dr. Spock, we're Captain Kirk. So we have what behavioural economists call a status quo bias. We tend to just stick with the status quo. Status quo here is opt in. So many people is opt out. Sorry, the status quo here is not to donate, and you have to opt in. So many people just stay with the status quo, which is not to donate. The status quo here is to donate. Many people stay with that status quo rather than choosing to opt out. So we have this so-called status quo bias. So again, this is predictable from behavioral economics theory. And there's a whole load of these biases. If you're interested, if you're really interested, I suggest you read Daniel Kahneman's book, which is called Thinking Fast and Slow, which is absolutely fantastic. Or you go on this website, it will give you a list of the sort of biases in decision making, particularly biases in decision making under uncertainty, which behavioral economics has identified, and which help explain our observed behavior, and which may lead people to make decisions which are not necessarily in their best interest or other people's interest. So this leads on to this idea of paternalist policies, and we're used to sort of paternalist policies in certain areas, like protection of children, protection of the mentally ill and so on. But here the idea is that rather than saying people are best placed to know what's in their self-interest and we should let unconstrained, it's saying people are making somewhat irrational decisions in some circumstances. And therefore there's a role for government to try and change their decisions. For example, people don't always join a pension scheme, and they might wind up with not having any pension when they retire. Maybe there's a role for government to either require them to join a pension scheme or to sort of shift them towards joining a pension scheme. So, for example, rather than the default option when you join a company being you have to choose to join a pension scheme, the default option should be if you join a company you have to choose to not join a pension scheme. So you have to choose to opt out rather than to opt in. If that was the default, if that was the required default, many more people would have pensions than who currently do. So by requiring that as a default, you've changed the sort of decision context and shifted people towards making better decisions from one perspective. Yeah?
Just checking, is making something a requirement, that's not nudge, is it? That would be
if you're allowed to opt out, it's a nudge. You change the default. But the default does not prevent you from making whatever decision you want. You can choose to be in the pension scheme or not be in the pension scheme. All it's done is change the default. The default is now being in rather than being out. So that does qualify as, it's not saying you must be in a pension scheme. It's changing a default, which is a different thing. So these ideas from behavioral economics are being increasingly used. I said they're providing a new rationale for intervention and new ways to intervene for things like encouraging people to make better choices about their food, things like organ donation, things like pension schemes and so on. And the idea that's most associated with this whole area is this idea of nudge. A nudge is to find non-coercive policy interventions that may give large benefits to error-prone individuals, in quotes, while imposing little or no harm on more rational individuals. So you can still choose. You're not constraining choice, but you're sort of nudging choices in what we think is a desired direction. Being in a pension scheme, donating organs, buying energy efficient equipment, or so on, rather than.
How do you measure success in this kind of policies under the frame?
It depends on the policy, like pension schemes. How many people choose to be in pension schemes?
But that doesn't give you an evaluation of the outcome of the social worker.
No. Okay. Well, then you get into the costs and benefits of being or not being in a pension scheme in the first place, which is a lot more complicated. And you have to value. We get into the cost-benefit analysis debate again. Do you get the idea behind this? And the phrase that's often used is paternalist policies, which is a bit well, it's a questionable label perhaps, but there's a lot of debates about whether we should or shouldn't intervene in this way. It's like, you heard of the nanny state? You heard of that phrase? It's a common. It's a phrase that's used a lot in the UK anyway. The nanny state means like the government doing things for you in the way government treating you as children, if you like. And this is a bit like treating you as children because you're government knows best. It's pushing you in certain directions. But the idea of nudge is that it doesn't force you in those directions. It still gives you the choice. It kind of nudges you in certain directions. And one of the papers Richard Thaler wrote was soft versus hard paternalism. But hard paternalism would be requiring you to do something through regulation. Soft means nudging you to do something. It's not the same. Okay? Okay, so we've had imperfect competition, macroeconomic stability, and so-called irrationality. The fourth one I want to just briefly look at is insurance. Again, in an idealized competitive market, markets should be able to provide insurance for different types of risk. Flood risk, earthquake risk, unemployment risk, retirement risk. Retirement, because you will be retired ultimately. Health risk, sick pay risk, and so on. You can get private insurance for these things, but often private insurance doesn't always work very well. I think in the interest of time, I want to go over this very quickly. It's covered in chapter 6. If you're interested, it's also covered in that paper, which I've put online. That paper actually does it much better than the book does, so I'd recommend that paper if you're reading anything. It's about how private markets don't always deliver certain types of insurance very well, and hence there is a role for governments in providing those types of insurance instead. So just to give an example, health insurance. Private market does not work very well for health insurance. From the insurance company's point of view, they want the healthy people to join their insurance scheme, because they'll be paying the premiums and won't have to pay out for any medical care. From the point of view as you as an individual, if you're unhealthy, you're more likely to want to join the insurance scheme because you're more likely to want the health care. So insurance companies, the interests of insurance companies are different from the interests of the potential insurees. In the US, where this issue is at its most marked, Obama had passed the Affordable Care Act, which prevented private health insurance companies from refusing to accept people with pre-existing conditions, i.e. pre-existing medical conditions, i.e. sick people who are most likely to need medical insurance. But it didn't require everybody to have a health insurance policy. And then the risk in that situation is you get something like this. The people at most risk of having bad health will be most likely to seek insurance because they'll be the most likely to need the insurance payments. But if those people are joining the insurance scheme, then the insurance companies will be spending a lot of money on treating these people. If they're spending a lot of money on treating these people, they're going to have to push the premiums up to cover that cost. If they push the premiums up, the cost of private health insurance up, then those people who are less likely to need, young people, fit, healthy people, less likely to be sick, they would say, I don't want to join this scheme. I don't want to spend £3,000 a year for health insurance if I'm not likely to need it. So those people don't join. So then you're left with a pool of people who do want to join, which are the sickest people. And the sickest people, again, push up the costs, therefore pushing up the premium. So you go into this spiral. So because it's voluntary, whether you join or not, you end up with a sort of dysfunctional situation, which economists called adverse selection, which is one reason why Obamacare and private medical insurance doesn't work very well in the United States. Another reason is sometimes referred to as moral hazard. And this is a situation of, suppose a company's got to pay out for the cost of medical treatment for somebody. Well, the medical treatment is negotiated, a client of the insurance company has got sick and he's gone to a doctor and the doctor's provided treatment and charged a fortune. Who's to tell whether what they're being charged is commensurate with the sickness? What's to stop that consultant overcharging for that medical treatment? They're going to get it back from the insurance company, the client's all right, the doctor's all right, it will be paid by the insurance company. So then the cost of treatment goes up, which creates a further problem with providing insurance through the private market. So you get this dysfunctional situation, as we have in the US. The US, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, one of the very few with private medical insurance rather than government-provided medical insurance, 3 times as much spent on healthcare as an average European country, health outcomes worse than an average European country. It doesn't work very well in the private sector. Markets in this area, particularly of health insurance, do not work very well because of these so-called adverse selection and moral hazard problems. Yeah? Does that make sense? So what most countries have done have said, okay, markets don't work very well, we'll have state provision instead. Compulsory, everybody has to join, everybody has to pay, including the young healthy people who are unlikely to need the treatment. They've still got to join, they've still got to pay the national insurance contributions or whatever. Compulsory inclusion and often public provision as well to avoid the problems of moral hazard. So that's the sort of thing that can go wrong with insurance when provided through markets, and the sort of rationale for governments getting involved in providing insurance rather than markets. I mean, you might view providing healthcare as a basic equity issue or human dignity. We don't want people to be without healthcare, which is absolutely true, but it's also the case that there's an efficiency issue as well. Markets just don't work very well if it's done privately. Yeah?
Just as some of the inefficiencies that you could also find in the health insurance sector and healthcare, mostly managed in the public sector. Maybe a little bit about the NHS, it's all around Britain. And I can also think on some healthcare systems in Latin America that are pretty much managed in the public sector, but they're not doing very well.
Okay, so why aren't they doing very well?
Because they're not sustainable in the long term. They're not sustainable, so maybe they should adapt some of the practices from the private sector.
Okay.
At least to make it sustainable.
Well, not sustainable because the cost of treatment's too high?
Sorry?
Their cost of treatment is too high, or why aren't they sustainable?
Yeah, maybe the cost of treatment on the what the people pay is not enough, and many people don't pay. And they're treated, which is
Okay, well that's an obvious.
makes it not sustainable.
Yeah, well, so there's inefficiency, there's problems in collecting the money, which is about the efficiency of the bureaucracy, or maybe the level of provision is not commensurate with the wealth of the country. Maybe the provision is not managed very well, so it's inefficient and therefore more costly than it should be. So that's a sort of set of problems with, yeah, I agree. It's like government failures versus market failures again. There's problems on both sides. I'm only looking at one side here.
What can you say about the NHS case regarding this?
Well, the NHS has plenty of problems of its own. The amount of it's complex. There's demographics, more and more elderly people needing treatment, so the cost of treatment's going up, and also health issues like diabetes placing a huge burden on the system. We have austerity policies, which I think they're rather misguided, but that has squeezed the amount of money going into the health service recently. So that there's a squeeze with the amount of money going in and the amount of treatment being required, and hence the quality of service has been going down. One solution is putting more money in, but also you've got to ensure that money is being well spent, so you've got to ensure efficiency in provision as well. So how best do you ensure that? Lots of questions about how best to efficiently manage public enterprises. Might there be cases where competition from the private sector will help, possibly?
And do you think it's a lot of pressure against the private competition?
It's a lot of what?
It's not a popular alternative to open up to private competition.
No, here it isn't. No, I will talk about.
Do you think it's a good alternative?
It depends on the context. I mean, open it up to private it's what's called contracting out. Depends on what you're contracting out. I mean, do I think that private companies could provide energy services to a hospital more efficiently than it can be done in-house? Yes, probably. As contracting out energy services. Do I think they could provide, surgery more cost effectively? That's different altogether. So it depends on the context.
Why do you say that advertising sector is not very popular here?
Well, I was thinking of, particularly in the health service, this notion of contracting out, well, not just the health service actually, this notion of contracting out services to the private sector often has a lot of opposition from unions and from the public. Good example being Sussex, actually, this university, who have contracted out a lot of the non-academic services, like grounds and energy and catering and everything else. And that was subject of sit-ins and protests a couple of years ago. So that whole area, drawing the boundary between public and private and opening up the public sector to competition and privatisation has always been very contentious politically. It divides left and right. Okay, just to wrap that one up then, so I gave you the health insurance example. That health isn't the only example. Sick pay, unemployment, retirement, some flood insurance tend to be frequently provided by the state for similar sort of reasons. Market's not working very well. So, to summarise that then, I've talked about 4 other types of market failure over and above the 4 that I talked about last week. Imperfect competition, unemployed resources, so-called irrationality and incomplete insurance. I've given you a few examples of the sort of policies that governments adopt to deal with those market failures. They're listed there. They're also listed in the book. So taken together then, that's 8 ideas, that's 8 categories of market failure. And those, they don't cover, I'm not saying that's entirely comprehensive, but it covers a lot of the issues that you're interested in, a lot of the activities of government are dealing with problems in one of those categories. And they are related. Obviously there's a close relationship between that. That's having only one producer in the market, that's only having a few, so that's a similar sort of problem. I said last week there's a lot of similarities between externalities and public goods, and there's close similarities here because a lot of it's to do with a lot of the insurance problems are to do with asymmetric information. But anyway, that's, I think, quite a helpful way of categorizing it and sort of organizing these different areas of activity. Right. So that's done on market failures. Are there any more questions on that lot so far? Right, I'm going to start this section on equity, then 5 minutes, and then we'll have a break. Okay. So the issue here, governments often want to intervene in order to improve fairness, improve equity, avoid inequity in various forms. It's a different idea for efficiency. Efficiency is making the best use of resources. Equity is about fair distribution of those resources. Maximizing the size of the cake versus how you divide the cake is a simple way of thinking of it. There are sometimes trade-offs between efficiency and equity, but equally there are sometimes not. There are many synergies. And the extent to which there are trade-offs or synergies is contested. It's a left versus right issue. It's in the same way as something like privatization is always contested. So there's masses of literature on this. I mean, you could think of one classic trade-off, for example, is historically we used to have very high rates of income taxes in this country and many other countries. So rich people would have, if they got an increase in their income, 90% would be taken away as tax, and they're left with 10%. And that was argued to be a disincentive to wealth creation because you're losing all that additional income in tax. And over the last 30 years, those rates have been progressively reduced and now very much lower in the UK and most other countries. So that's possibly a trade-off there. But there's also maybe synergies, and I think increasingly evidence is pointing towards the latter. The OECD has published some good stuff on this recently, on the potential detrimental effects of inequality on economic growth. If you have inequality, what I've called their social capital, that things like the level of education and skills in the population is often lower than it could be. And then if it's lower than it could be, then we're missing opportunities to create wealth and to deliver economic growth and so on. And inequality contains at least all sorts of social problems and lack of political legitimacy and so on. So there are trade-offs, there are synergies. Where the balance lies in any one instance is contested. Depends on ideology, and, well, it depends on evidence as well, but also ideology. There's no universally accepted criteria of what is fair and what isn't fair. Attempts to improve equality, are a major rationale for government intervention, but also the impact on equality is a consideration in more or less any policy that you're looking at. What are the distributional impacts of policy X? Will the poor be hurt more than the rich? Who will bear the burden of this policy? So it's not only a rationale for intervention, it's always a consideration in more or less any, whatever the policy is about, it more or less always appears. Just got a couple of slides on this trade-off which you might find interesting. They're taken from a book by Richard Wilkerson and I forget her first name. Kate, thank you, Kate Pickett. Came out a few years ago called The Spirit Level, 2009. Quite a controversial book because their statistics was rather poor, but nevertheless had some interesting messages. They were arguing about the problems associated with inequality. So what we've got here, we've got this graph. That index there is a sort of composite measure of a variety of social problems. Infant mortality, homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, obesity, a whole bunch of different things which you can see as social problems, a sort of composite measure of how bad they are in different countries. And this is a measure of the level of income equality in those different countries. And their argument is the worse, the higher the level of income inequality, the worse all these social problems are. And they were suggesting a strong correlation between the two, so it looks pretty strong there. Yeah? And I've ringed the US, it's up here, because it's always a massive outlier in any graph that you draw. So, whereas the same measure of social problems, but here plotted against mean per capita income, like average, like the mean, if you know what I mean. No obvious correlation. So that they made it was quite a strong argument of the problems of inequality, and the OECD is now saying very similar things. Okay, so what I'm going to do.
What's the reason you said it was not professional? You said statistics are not professional.
Yes. They're simple bivariate correlations. They didn't do any multivariate regression. They were distorted. Some of the graphs were distorted by the outliers, particularly the US. You took out the US, the correlation was much weaker. There was a big pushback from both some economists and also from the right, political right, about their arguments. There's a whole load online if you want to investigate it. I think the criticisms were fair. That it was not sophisticated analysis. But whether they are sufficient to detract from their overall argument, I think that's a different question.
I was going to ask if they actually just corrected the document, just made it up, but it was
Just made it up? No, I didn't make it up. Oh no, this is government statistics they're using for these different countries. No, it's all the data's fine.
that is fine.
Yeah.
Then that's
Yeah. A couple more minutes. What I'm going to do is divide this idea of equity, equality, fairness into 4 categories. I'm calling equality of rights, equality of opportunity, equality of outcomes, and equality between generations. Okay, which is just, I think it's quite a nice way of dividing it up. So just very briefly on this first one before we have a break. Equality of rights is about so-called human rights. And that is something which is embodied in international law since 1948 with the UN Convention or Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and in rights. And there have since been several covenants and conventions. I'm not quite sure the difference between a covenant and a convention, but they're supposed to be legally binding on the signatory countries. So covenants and conventions on certain issues like prohibition of torture or civil and political rights and so on. So this is a post-Second World War idea. It's embodied in international law under the UN. It's really shaped political discourse since the Second World War. It's a very important rationale for policy, protection of human rights, equity, equality before the law in terms of basic dignity, basic rights. So as an example, in the UK, we have the Human Rights Act of 1998, which in turn puts into the UK law some of the provisions of a European Convention on Human Rights. It goes back to 1953. That's pre the European Union. And this is some of the rights that it incorporates into UK law. And similar countries have similar legislation embodying similar rights. So freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, association, right to marry and start a family, and so on. But of course the issue with all of those is that what that means is open to interpretation. And we have, the law provides these general provisions and there's legislative interpretation by the judiciary in particular cases about what this means or doesn't mean. And there's ongoing debate about what it does mean or doesn't mean. And in the particular case of the UK, we've had a lot of controversy about this legislation, and in particular about terrorism and the protection of the state, protection of human life versus protection of human rights of terrorists, and whether terrorists should be deported and so on. And the last, not the current government, but the previous government was threatening to get rid of this act and replace it with a British Bill of Rights or something like that. I don't quite know where we got to on this issue, but the Brexit creates further complications for it. But the more general point is that human rights are central to policy in practically all countries of the world, have been since the Second World War, a rationale for policy, but in all cases contested, debated in terms of what exactly this means. And there are areas where there's real problems. Right, I think it's time for a break. Is there any questions on that particular issue before we have a break? Okay, 10-minute break then. Okay, we're going to start. Okay, so I was talking about equity, and as I said, I divided it into 4 categories, which is one way of looking at it, and we've done the first one, which I've called equity and rights, human rights. So this is the second, equality of opportunity, and the idea here is that everybody should be able to, compete for jobs, compete for resources. So everybody should be have equal treatment in those contexts. There shouldn't be a discrimination on the basis of somebody's race or somebody's disability or on gender or whatever. And obviously, getting this has been a major political battle for decades. Like a famous landmark here was the U.S. Civil Rights Act in '64. After all the protest marches and everything else. Similar stories in other countries. In the UK, we have an Equality Act, 2010, which I think that sort of brought together a whole range of different acts that have been done over the years in different areas. Like there was an act on race discrimination, and another one on sexual equality and so on. I think it sort of brought them all together. One of the things that does, which is common to other legislation in other countries, it includes provision for positive action. So, for example, I think in the area of employment, if you have 2 candidates for a job and they're both kind of more or less equally qualified, but one of them is from a disadvantaged group, whatever you define that group to be, then you're supposed to have a preference towards the person from the disadvantaged group. And obviously debates about what that means and whether that should be done are another contentious issue. But it's there in the legislation in this country. So one key issue for equality of opportunity is, do poor children from poor families have the same opportunities as children from wealthy families? And usually no. If I'm taking the US again as an example, the American dream is the idea that anyone can make it, just based on your own skills, your own ability, your own hard work. Whatever your background, you can make it, you can become rich, you can join the American dream. And social mobility, which is like the moving between sort of different income groups, has actually been going down for decades in the US and in many OECD countries. It has in the UK. It's much lower now than it was when I was growing up in the 1960s. Economists measure this by something called intergenerational income elasticity, and basically what it's about is, to what extent does your parents' income predict children's income later in life? To a very great extent in the US and in many other countries. Children from low-income families have a 1% chance of reaching the top 5% of the income distribution. From high-income families, I forget how they're defining lower high income there. It might be the bottom or top quintile, I'm not sure. But anyway, children from high-income families got a 22% chance. Huge difference. This graph here is a measure of this income elasticity. The higher it is, the worse it is. But actually, from that graph, the UK is even worse than the US in that respect. Much higher in the Scandinavian countries. So, again, equality of opportunity, very important. For equality of opportunity, promoting equality of opportunity, a common rationale for intervention, for policies of various forms to try and prevent this, and recent trends in equality of opportunity not particularly good in many countries. Third area, and very closely related to this, is what economists call equality of outcomes, which is like what wealth do different people, do different groups have? How much access do they have to resources? How equal is income across society? And there's at least two dimensions here. One is the idea of a poverty line. You know, we don't want people to starve. We don't want people to not have a roof over their head. We do not want people to be in desperate poverty. So basic human dignity, human rights requires you have a minimum level of income, a minimum level of access to resources, to education and to food and to housing and to so on. So there's a minimum level. And separate to that, but obviously related to that, is the overall distribution of wealth in a society. Is it people might be above the minimum, but are there huge disparities in the groups that are above the minimum, or are they more equal in income? And we go back to the point I was showing earlier about are there trade-offs and are there synergies between equality and efficiency, and what are the potential consequences of inequality? But they're kind of like two different things. One's a safety net, and one's a overall level of equality. And doing something about this, trying to ensure safety nets, and trying to redistribute income and resources in various ways, is again a massive rationale for intervention, a massive area of government activity. Over and above, separate to dealing with market failures and so on. So just to elaborate a bit on those issues. To begin with, the idea of a poverty threshold or a safety net, a minimum level. We often hear talk of the poverty line. You know, how many people are there below the poverty line? What is a basic minimum for a decent life in the country? What policies should be used to provide that basic minimum? And one issue here is, how do you measure that basic minimum? Is it just money, or is it other things, like housing, for example, or access to transport facilities, or so on? Do you measure it in income, or do you measure it in wealth? And wealth there means also assets like houses, or how many bonds you hold, or material goods and things. I mean, one key difference there between income and wealth is housing. So you've got a lot of people in this country, in many countries, that elderly people, retired people, they're on a low income, they're on a pension, but they own their own home, which is worth a great deal of money. So in wealth, which includes the value of that home, they're doing quite well, but they're on a low income. So measuring on the basis of income, measuring on the basis of wealth, makes a big difference for understanding this. Do you measure this on a per capita basis or on a household basis? If you've got two people in a house, they don't require twice the income of one person in a house in order to live at the same level of, same quality of life. Or if you've got children, if you've got two children, you've got a household with one adult and two children. You don't need the same level of income for the children as you do for the adult to have the same. I'll explain this very well, am I? Households with more than one person. If you compare a one-person household with a two-person household, the one-person household, the two-person household needs less than 2 times the income of the one-person household to have the same quality of life. Does that make sense? Right. Yeah.
Why, for now, it seems that it's really far from reality in the sense that this concept really neglect diversity, like whatever income, number, or wealth you can be. I mean, like people in village, the one that I found normally, they don't care with big houses. They're fine staying as what they are, having their own access. They don't they don't eat meat like every day, but they can have eat their own food in their own way. You know, I mean, those things are really specific that even not the poverty line can be, defined. And that's where in the end I found, what is this line for? Is it just to identify which what's the objective of doing these things?
Well, the objective is to see how many people are in poverty. But yeah, I mean, you say they're growing their own food. I mean, that doesn't occur in this country, but it's very important in many other countries. So that's a sort of non-monetary measure of their.
But that's exactly why. I mean, if you define people how they're poor in that way, you can't even find the real poor one because it's like the same. I mean, maybe. And there is a big story that the African people, they say that they think they're poor because they're below global poverty line, but apparently they're not. They're having their own life, and it's the same with Indonesia. I mean, there's so many things.
Well, yeah, I agree. That's the point, really. And what I'm trying to say on this slide is hard to measure. It's hard to measure even in a developed country, but it's much harder to talk about that sort of context where people have under.
This line anyway.
It is still widely used, both internationally, the UN. And also within individual countries, define poverty line, which is relative to mean income. But that's the point here, that it is a very hard thing to measure, and it's partly subjective and so on. And also this one here, are you measuring income before taxation and before benefits and so on, or after those transfers have taken place and so on. So it's tricky. But if you were to look globally, if you take the UN definition of the poverty line, the story is quite good over the last 30 years. More and more people rising above the poverty line owing to emerging economies, particularly China, but by no means solely China. Many South American countries, many sub-Saharan African countries. So 2 billion people below the UN poverty line back in 1990, 700 million now. So that's a good news story, accepting all the qualifications about how you measure the poverty line. I still think that's a success. But if you were to turn your attention to overall inequality rather than just the minimum level, the story is a bit different. And again, you've got a measurement issue. How do you measure inequality within a society? And the thing that's commonly used is, this is called a Lorenz curve. Here you've got a percentage of population in the society, and here you've got the percentage of income. So it's saying here, if income was distributed perfectly equally throughout this society, that line, this curve would just be a straight line like that. The more that curve shifts across to the right, the more unequal the distribution of income or wealth is within a society. So what this is saying that the top, say the top 10% of the population here have got 80% of the wealth or something like that. So the more that curve is to the right, the more unequal the society is. And it's measured by this thing called a Gini index, which is that area A divided by area A plus B. And the bigger that number is, the bigger that index is, the more unequal a society is. Actually, that graph there shows that the red countries are very unequal, and the green are more equal, and pink somewhat in between. And the story here, if you take this measure, this Gini index, or these Lorenz curves, inequality has been getting worse for 30 years plus within the OECD. I'm not so sure about the rest of the world. Certainly, probably there are some success stories, like Brazil, for example. I think inequality has gone down substantially over the last 20, 30 years. But within the OECD, the general trend is towards increasing inequality. So each of these dots is a country, and it shows the difference between mid-1980s and 2013 of that index. They're all going up. This measure of inequality is going up.
Any ideas of why is that happening?
Why is that happening? Quite a complex story. Partly globalization, partly the policies that have been adopted. We've reduced income tax rates, reduced corporate income tax. We've deregulated banking. Certain sectors of the economy, like finance sector, have got a great deal of wealth. There's been changes in skill needs. Many manufacturing jobs have been lost. People who used to do those manufacturing jobs, they used to be quite good jobs, quite highly paid jobs. They're now in relatively poorly paid professions, like working as baristas or something like that. It's a whole complex series of social changes, some of which are general developments in technology and the structure of economies, some of which are deliberate choices by governments as a consequence of lobbying by various groups. So it's a whole mix. And the story varies a lot from one country to another. Far worse in some countries than another. Interesting that the overall trend is up, though. It's sort of across the board. Is there any exceptions there? Turkey, okay. Who's from Turkey? It's got better, apparently. No, this might be out of date. This is a good reference, actually. OECD report on inequality, 2015. It's quite recent data. And what's happened, as I'm sure many of you heard, wealth is increasingly being concentrated in the top 1% of society, or the top 0.1% of society. And again, it's particularly bad in the US. The US is, again, an outlier in this respect. This graph here is the growth in income of different groups since 1985. So that's the highest income group and that's the lowest income group. So the highest income groups have got a lot richer, relatively speaking, than the lower income groups. In the US, so median income has remained pretty stable for 20 years, I think. Some groups have seen their income fall in real terms. If you want to know more about these trends, I recommend Joe Stiglitz's work, another Nobel Prize-winning economist. That's a really good book, Price for Inequality. If you haven't, it's particularly about the US, but a lot of these things are common to other countries as well. And you haven't got time to read the book, like me, then I'll put a couple of videos on the website. And I distinguish between inequality of opportunity and inequality of outcomes, and obviously they're closely related. Because if you have a very unequal society, and if low-income groups lack access to decent education or decent food or whatever, then their opportunities are constrained, and then that will reproduce itself subsequently in inequality of outcomes, as that little cartoon shows. Or conversely, if wealthy families can afford to send their kids to private schools, they've got the right connections, they've got, they can fund their son or daughter during an internship or something on which they're not being paid, and all the rest of it. So these two are distinguished between equality of opportunity and equality of outcomes, but obviously they're very closely linked. Right, so what to do about this? How does this relate to policy? A massive part of government activity is redistributing income, redistributing goods to deal with inequality. One example, progressive taxation. The rich are taxed proportionately more than the low-income groups. The percentage rate of taxation for a high-income group is more than for a low-income group. If your income is below a certain level, you don't pay tax at all. That's called progressive taxation. Tax of income, tax of property, tax of capital gains, and so on. Not sales tax. The tax on goods, when you buy goods, you pay 15% sales tax, VAT it's called in this country. That's actually regressive in that it hurts low-income groups more than high-income groups. But one way of improving the distribution of income is progressive taxation, taxing the rich more. Another is social insurance schemes. So I gave an example earlier of health insurance being a market failure because the private market doesn't work. So that's one rationale for government provision of health insurance, is that private markets don't work. But another equally important rationale is equity. We want people, regardless of background, to have access to decent healthcare. So it's an equity rationale. Same for unemployment, same for retirement. Government provides insurance to mitigate these inequalities. You have specific, more targeted benefits, sickness benefit, disability, state free education or support for higher education, which we used to have, maternity benefit. In this country we have child benefit. If you get a payment from the state if you have children. You get child tax credit as well, so you get reduced taxation. If you're a low income group, you pay less tax on your housing to the local authority. You get exemptions from housing, or you might get state provided housing, council housing, something which in this country we have less of now than we used to. Subsidized food, perhaps. In the US they have food stamps for low income groups. So in many of these cases, rather than merely providing the low income groups with more income, you're providing them with specific goods or means to access those goods, like housing, or like food, or like education. And there's a debate about which is best. Are you better giving the poor money, or are you better giving them food stamps so they can go and buy food? Right, or do you give them money so they can choose what to spend that money on, or whatever? But the rationale behind it, all of that, is obviously redistribution, overcoming problems of inequality. Might be regulations. Minimum wage is a regulation designed to deal with inequality. It's actually a price floor. And we talked about price ceilings last week and some of the problems they could cause. In principle, the minimum wage could cause problems in that it might lead to more unemployment, although the evidence for that is actually pretty weak. Maybe because most minimum wage laws around the world they're pretty low. They're too low to have much effect on the level of employment. But it's another approach, and funding education and training, improving skills and so on, so people can access jobs and access sources of income. And all of these are incredibly important. If you look at the total aggregate of government activity, these policies to improve equality form a very large part, and they absolutely dominate government spending on all these different forms of social spending. It's absolutely huge compared to other categories of government spending. So, and this is really significant. Okay. And then just to finish off, I thought to finish off this discussion of equality, one other thing you could also consider here is equality between generations, because up to now I've been talking about equality between contemporary generations, the rich and the poor. What about future generations, 100 years hence and so on? What about our children, our grandchildren? And here you get into, in particular, this notion of sustainability. Now, at least a third of you are doing a degree in sustainability, and another third are doing a degree in energy, which includes a lot about sustainability. So I'm hoping you are discussing what sustainability means within that at some point, because I don't want to spend too long on it here. But one way of viewing sustainability is equality between generations. So we are not taking away from our children by blowing the world's resources now. And it involves all sorts of very complicated issues, like clearly we're using up non-renewable resources, so our future generations can't use them. Are we providing sufficient substitutes for them? We are providing infrastructure, we're providing knowledge, we're providing other things. Do they compensate for the non-renewable resources? How do we make decisions about things which have very long-term consequences? Have you heard of discount rates? Yeah. A few of you. Because the idea here, if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, like I've talked about last week, how do you value a benefit that occurs 10 years' time rather than now? Normally you apply an interest rate or something, so £1 in 10 years' time is worth less than having £1 right now. What about in 100 years' time? If you discount that very heavily, you almost ignore it altogether because it's so far away that its value right now is very small. But then if you do that, you're devaluing the life chances of future generations. So there's a whole bunch of issues there about equality between generations and the meaning of sustainability. So, to sum up, I'll try to talk about equality and equity. I'll try to define it in 4 categories: quality of rights, quality of opportunity, quality of outcomes, equality between generations. In each case, I've showed you some of the policies that are justified on the basis of concerns about equality under each of those headings. I've talked about a state of progress under those headings. So they provide rationales for government policy in the same way as market failures provide rationales for government policy. So now we've got a set of 12 ideas, all of which provide rationales for various forms of government intervention. And a large part of what governments do can be grouped under one or more of those headings. Right. Okay, any questions on that? There's a few yawns. Okay, so the last 20 minutes or 15 minutes I'm going to talk about government failures. Some of the things that can go wrong with government intervention that we need to be aware of. So I've argued that policy can be rationalised, justified in terms of efficiency, equity and other values. However, the policies to address those problems might be biased towards the interests of particular groups. There are reasons to expect that in the way the political process works. And it is possible that government provision of things like healthcare might be bureaucratic and inefficient compared to what might occur in a private market, in a competitive market. So you've got those two types of problem. The risk of decisions by public authorities being biased towards the interests of certain groups rather than towards social welfare as a whole, and public provision of goods and public regulation being bureaucratic and inefficient. There's two risks. If that is the case, so we're going to look at, I said, both sides of the coin. There are market failures and government failures. Both are imperfect.
First one is more about corruption.
Corruption is part of it, but by no means all. It's part of it. So the point is, if you've got a market failure, it doesn't just necessarily justify intervention. You've got to look at what are the costs and benefits of intervention. And some of them might be problems with that intervention. And because we have these problems with policy, it may well be the case that in some instances it's better to remove policy altogether or to change the type and nature of policy in order to reduce these problems and thereby increase social welfare as a whole. So, for example, in the past we used to have nationalised industries providing electricity and other goods. In many cases they were bureaucratic and inefficient. We've had 20, 30 years now of privatising and liberalising and bringing the market in to those industries, making them more efficient, arguably improving social welfare. So it's a type of policy, but it's a policy that is reducing government involvement rather than increasing it to overcome some of the problems with government involvement. So I'm going to elaborate a bit on those. Under 4 headings, there are different ways you can classify these things, and I said that theory of so-called government failures is not particularly well developed, as compared to market failures, but I thought it just useful to have those 4 categories: interest group bias, what I'm calling geographical and temporal biases, regulatory capture, and bureaucratic inefficiency. And the issue here is really the problems associated with representatives. You might be representative in terms of your member of parliament, or the executive. The government executive is sort of representative of society as a whole. You've got government bureaus, government agencies. They all represent us and are acting on our behalf, in our interest. They're representatives of the broader polity. So they're acting in our interest, but they're costly for us to monitor. We don't pay much attention to what regulators and the NHS and MPs and others are doing on a day-to-day basis. We've got our own lives to live. We can't be bothered with looking very closely at what they are doing. But what they are doing will be monitored very closely by people whose interests are very strongly affected. So I'm not paying much attention to the current legislation that's being proposed on rental housing, I'm sure landlords are. Landlords are lobbying very hard, probably, in terms of what shape that legislation will take. Legislation is designed to be in our collective interest, but those who are paying the most attention, those who are lobbying, are those who are most directly affected, which is landlords. So they're most closely monitored, lobbied, and influenced by interest groups. And also, it is the case, although obviously many people in public policy are seeking to do the best for society, they also have their own interests. MPs want to be re-elected. They want to have a good job to go to after they've finished their term of office. If you're a representative of a particular constituency, a particular geographical area, you're a member of Parliament for Sussex, you want to represent Sussex interests, as indeed you should. But also, you want to represent society's interests as well, the UK's interests. And there might be a bit of a conflict between those two. So because representatives are partly self-interest, they're going to pay attention to particular constituencies and particular interest groups. And the risk of that dynamic is that decisions might be biased in favour of particular constituencies or particular interest groups. And one form this takes is the phrase is rent-seeking. And the idea behind rent-seeking, it's different from competition in the market, whereby, as you saw a couple of weeks ago, you were competing, but overall social interest was maximised. And wealth was increased, if you like. Here, this is about lobbying and other activities to maximise one group's share of existing wealth rather than creating new wealth. So what does that mean? Let's give some examples. Suppose the government is handing out a subsidy. There'll be a lot of activity from various groups to ensure that they capture that subsidy, lobbying activities for government. Maybe there'll be corruption, as you said, so that one group gets handouts from the government for a particular area. Maybe the government is proposing regulations to improve health and safety or reduce environmental emissions for overall social benefit. But those groups who will be most affected by those regulations might be lobbying very heavily for exemptions or for those regulations to be weakened in order to avoid costs falling upon them. Maybe a firm is threatened by cheap imports from another country. Maybe they'll be lobbying for tariffs, so tariffs will be imposed upon those imports so that their market will be protected in this country. The net result is that you as consumers will be paying higher prices for the goods, but the interests of that domestic firm will be protected. Maybe you're a food producer and you want to ensure that you get a minimum price for your wheat or for your corn or something, so you lobby for a price floor, a minimum price for food products. That's what we have in many countries, various reasons for that, but often the net result is consumers pay higher prices and the interests of the farming lobby are protected. So they're lobbying to protect their own interests in various ways, and possibly to the detriment of society as a whole. Because in any political debate about regulation of food prices or about environmental regulation or health and safety regulation or whatever, the interest groups that run the risk of facing high costs will be those that are lobbying the hardest. And hence there's a risk of decisions being sort of distorted in their favour. And they can do that do that in various ways, corruption being the most obvious, but they can lobby government, they can provide donations to political parties during the election, so that in the expectation they'll get returns in terms of weaker regulation or something should that party get elected. Huge issue in the US, for example. Hospitality means that they can take the minister out for lunch and talk about their needs in a very informal way. They can provide information. They can exaggerate the costs that they face by regulation and provide information to decision makers, and which might distort the decisions in their favour. They can fund policy analysis and research to argue their case. They can get media coverage, and so on. There are various ways in which interest groups can secure their interests within the political process. And the risk is you get decisions biased in their interest rather than the interests of society as a whole. You get wasted resources, reduced efficiency, and so on. That might seem a bit abstract, so I've got an example here. Simple example. This is taxis in New York. Taxis in New York are regulated. You can't run a taxi in New York unless you've got this medallion. There's only a limited number of medallions that are available. There's only a limited number of taxis that can run in New York. And the taxi companies lobby very hard for the maintenance of this system. And they provide reasons for this: safety. In fact, when we come on to look at an example policy analysis, where one of the chapters in the book discusses the regulation of taxis. And it provides some possible reasons why you want to regulate taxis. But there's no good reason why you want to have a cap on the number of medallions. But it serves the interests of the taxi companies. If you restrict supply of taxis, you can push up the prices of taxi services. If you push up the prices of taxi services, the taxi companies will gain. Taxi customers will lose. And that's what they do. They've basically got a cartel, a limited number of companies running these cars, limited number of cars, very high prices. These medallions change, well, what's that? Medallion prices went to $1 million. I don't know how many taxis are covered by one medallion, but they're absurdly expensive prices for these medallions because there's only a limited number. It's only a limited number because the government requires it to be a limited number, and the government requires that because they've been successfully lobbied by the taxi companies to the benefit of the taxi companies, to the detriment of people wanting to use taxis in New York. And there have been other examples around the world, and where these regulations have been removed, so you can have more taxis competing in the market, prices have fallen, more trips have taken place, consumers have benefited. So this is what's called rent seeking. They've been successful in protecting their own interests through lobbying. Uber actually is now threatening, I don't know what the current situation in New York, but in many cities around the world, Uber is an alternative to regulated taxis, and therefore it's posing a threat to that model. But is that making sense? You get an idea of...
I was going to ask, in this scenario, clearly the government have an interest in having this as well, because they're getting $1 million per medallion. So what would that be classified as? But it's not really...
Yeah, it might be in there.
Symbiote.
Yes, possibly. But social welfare as a whole, down. If you look at the sort of what people are prepared to pay for a taxi ride and so on.
Is there anything that would be classified as?
What would be classified as?
Rent seeking is done by the interest group, but if the government has an interest...
Well, as I said, representatives are partly self-interested, so if they're getting their own personal remuneration out of that, is that what you mean, or just revenue to the government?
$1 million for the New York City...
Who's getting that revenue? Is that being
what I mean, because it might
change hands from one provider to another?
because they themselves will be able to price up the cost against tax.
It's not tax revenue to the city government. It's the price of these when they're sold from one company to another. Yeah. So. Yeah.
In a similar case in Toronto, I think it's private, like citizens who own the medallions. And there's an issue with stockpiling where individuals who own like dozens or more.
Yeah.
Sell them, even though they're not allowed to own more than a certain amount. So it's not necessarily that that number is directly to the government.
But it's just one example of a common theme. Interest groups sort of distorting decisions in their favour rather than social interests as a whole. Hopefully we'll talk about that more on Wednesday and the issues that raises. So Another way this might occur is that I've mentioned already, we have a situation in many countries in which representatives, for example in the national parliament, represent certain geographical areas. You've got the MP for Brighton and Lewis or whatever, or for Brighton. So they are elected to represent their constituents in that area. But sometimes there might be a tension between the interests of the constituents in that area and the interests of society as a whole. And it's not obvious how that tension should be resolved. Should they prioritise their constituents' interests or should they prioritise society's interest? Often they prioritise their constituents' interests. And that can lead to problems. It may well be the case that or it is the case, we need to do something about nuclear waste. We need to find a successful way of disposing of nuclear waste. This threatens us long term. But it is hard to find, if any, most constituents most representatives of the geographical area would oppose a nuclear waste disposal site being in their area, even if they think we need this for the benefit of society as a whole, because they're trying to represent their own constituents' interests. Or it might be the case that agricultural subsidies are detrimental to welfare as a whole within a society, but they might be of benefit to farmers in a particular region. So the representative of that region might lobby hard for the continuation of agricultural subsidies, protecting their constituents' interests at the detriment of society as a whole. Sports stadiums, they might lobby hard for a sports stadium to be located in their region, but it's funded by taxpayers from elsewhere. So there's a tension between broader social interest and geographic interest, and that can often lead to problems. And in the US, you have this thing called pork barrel politics, whereby each constituency is trying to get a bit of the pie, a bit of the government subsidy to benefit their own constituents. And you end up with a situation with subsidies being handed out everywhere. And overall social interest is undermined as a result of that. So it's a difficult tension, but it can lead to distorted outcomes. Yeah.
What is the difference between geographic bias and local protectionism?
Local protectionism. What do you mean by local protectionism?
Like trade.
Okay, well that's more. I was thinking here more of a subnational level. Trade protectionism would be normally a national level. Yes, so then in that case it's similar issue at a high level. You're protecting your national interests. Well, no, sorry, it's a different issue. No, because trade protectionism by a nation state would probably be detrimental to the interests of that nation as a whole, but it might be of benefit to the interests of producers of whatever good. Certain firms within that country are producing that good. So.
The reason why I ask this is because from my home country, we
Yeah.
have massive subsidies for electric vehicle,
Yeah.
and the subsidies divided generally into three levels: national, provincial, and municipal.
Yeah.
But some province or some municipalities, they would require automakers, if you would like to sell your car in my state or my province and get my subsidy apart from the national subsidy, you have to use some of the parts produced by my local suppliers.
Yeah.
Like that. But it's sometimes very impossible for an automaker. I already have my my plant here. I already have established my supplier systems. I don't need to,
Yes.
have one more suppliers from your region.
Yeah.
So the automakers can't get the.
It's effectively it's designed to protect the local manufacturers, but actually it's detrimental to the development of the industry as a whole.
It's not anything like the farmer.
Yeah. Well, that could be an example of what I'm talking about here. Then, yeah.
That's what I mean.
An interesting example. Yeah. Okay. Right. Nearly done. And then a similar issue is about the relative weight to be given to short term and long term. I think you're probably familiar with this. Governments get re-elected every 4 years, 5 years. there's an incentive to do things which are going to be beneficial over the short term, make them look good, have tax cuts prior to the election, but then lower the costs into the longer term. So there might be a bias there as well. Prioritizing short-term benefits over long-term costs. Another example, this is a particular example of rent seeking really, is that if you have environmental regulation, safety regulation, health regulation and so on, you're going to get, or economic regulation when you're regulating the prices charged by natural monopolies, you're obviously going to get lobbying from the regulated parties involved for regulations that best serve their interest. That lobbying can be effective, partly because strong lobbying, partly because the industry being regulated knows much better than the regulator what it can or can't afford. So it can sort of distort cost estimates and say, we can't possibly afford this because it will put us out of business or whatever. And the regulator is not in a good position to counter that argument because it lacks the information. So that puts the regulator at a disadvantage. And also, sometimes the regulators are themselves formed by people who used to work in the industry. So they know the industry and they sort of identify with the industry and so on. And the risk of that sort of situation is that sometimes regulations can act in the interest of the regulated industry rather than in the interest of society as a whole. A classic example was in the US in the 1930s where the railroad industry was regulated, and it sought to protect the industry against competition from cars rather than broader societal interest. Another example, arguably, is what happened in Japan, and very ineffective regulation of safety of the nuclear industry. And it turns out that the safety panels were dominated by people from the industry, the people from the regulators sort of worked for the regulator and then ended up working for the industry, or vice versa, the revolving doors there. There's a lack of expertise and so on. So there's a risk of regulation being ineffective, and at its worst, the regulator acting for the interests of the regulated party rather than for the interests of society as a whole. And the term that is used there is regulatory capture. They're being captured by the interests of the regulated party. And I've run out of time. My last, please before Wednesday have a look at this section on government failures, because it will probably explain these things better than I can, including the section on bureaucratic inefficiency, which was the very last category I was going to cover. But if I skip that and say what I've presented in the last 20 minutes is these 4 types of government failures to parallel the different types of market failures I've talked about. And in the slides and in the chapter it talks about the type of policies that might be used to deal with those government failures. So overall that gives you then a total of 16 different ideas, and a lot of activity, government activity, can be seen as trying to deal with one of these, or trying to deal with those in the sense of finding ways to minimize interest group bias or minimize bureaucratic efficiency and so on. But I've really run out of time, so please read the chapter on government failures. And I'll see you all on Wednesday.
So the class, I keep thinking of these issues about the redistribution of the wealth or the profits or whatever. Because, I don't know, I feel like the system has some sort of regulations sometimes work well and then they are well placed and stuff. But for example, salaries are mostly not very regulated at all.
No.
In order to allow the salaries to grow as much as they need, instead of profits from corporations and big companies are always going toward the top.
Yes.
And the investors. And inflation is also pressuring salaries.